The first part of what we're going to talk about with Romanticism is, first of all, what it is. And remember, this is coming from the neoclassicist time of uh, Enlightenment that we just ended. And this was a reaction to that Enlightenment. Um, it was a rejection of the kind of the sterile, mm, everything has to be reasoned out, everything has to have a reason, very strict looking way of looking at things, and it moves to more of a um, the exaltation of the beauty of nature as uh, much bigger than just a hey, that's pretty, but a way of life almost. And so it looks at um, the styles are reflected in a lot of the art, but on top of that, a lot of it is reflected in the thought of the time. So we're going to go into a little bit of all of that. The first part is, remember we talked about how France had done their revolution, and now they were going to be um, not governed by a king and such. But this sort of backfires in the sense that Napoleon takes charge as a military dictator in 1799. However, initially, this isn't really a bad thing. I mean, yes, he is a military dictator, but he does a huge amount to change the mentality of the region. So he, first of all, does conquer most of Western Europe. You can see from the map that most of it is now yellow, which is the French Empire, and even the parts that aren't yellow are French dependencies, so they're still connected to France. Um, and then um, what he does here is he promotes the ideas of liberty and fraternity and equality throughout his empire. He redoes the education system. He does a like it establishes a law throughout the land that's known as the Code Napoleon. He increases nationalism. So nationalism is the idea that the pride of where you're from, pride in where you come from. Um, and he basically improves the areas that he takes over. The problem is that he keeps taking places over. So, because of this, various countries come together and ally against him. And in this, he ends up first of all, he kind of bites off a little bit more than he can chew because he attacks or tries to take over Russia, but in doing so, the weather is horrible in Russia, as many of you may have guessed, and so it is pretty far from their resources in France. So between food shortages and weather, out of his 600,000 men army, he ends up with 100,000. That's all that survive. And so then these allied countries are able to defeat him the first time, and so he does end up with his forces going to the basically going to into exile on the Isle of Elba, and he stays there for some time, but he does recover, raises a new army, and tries to start again. But in this one, he is for the last and final time, he is defeated, and he is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo by the British Duke of Wellington. And at this point, he never rises again. He ends up living all the rest of his life in the Isle of Saint Helena, which is in West Africa or off the coast of West Africa. Okay, and then the important thing, though, is like I said, he did a lot of good things, and so he becomes the very first 19th century romantic hero. Because while he was a dictator, he really did have a lot of good ideas and the good of France in mind, or the good of his area. Because, like I said, he conquered much more than France. Um, and from there, we get into a little bit more of the actual thinking of the minds. So one of the thoughts that was very common during this time was perpetrated by um, Edmund Burke, and he was an Irish statesman, and um, basically came up with the idea that society, like today's society, is based on the societies that came before it and new thinkers of this age, the synthesis of these two things. And um, that's one of the things that he perpetuates. And this is, I guess you could say, almost a precursor to the ideas that will be presented by Darwin later. But the idea that society grows and changes because of the societies before. Another one is that there's a difference between normal beauty, like I said, this is pretty, and the sublime, which is awe. Have you ever seen a storm roll in with so much power that you're just kind of staring, or you see lightning strike and you're just in awe, or you see just a particularly amazing sunset that you have to stop and just stare at it. So this is the sublime, and this is what they're talking about when they talk about the romantic sublime, the idea that nature can inspire these sort of awe moments, and that is um, characteristic of life in general, that life can do this, can inspire these awe moments. Okay. Um, from there, you go on to Hegel, and Hegel is a professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin, and he taught that the world consisted of an absolute mind. Okay, so that's what this absolute mind. So what this was basically the idea that the evolutionary process is mental evolution, not physical, okay? But that the evolutionary process is the spirit seeking to know its own self, okay? And that this is explained by what they call the dialect. And it basically means that every condition, um, every situation, okay, every thesis confronts its opposite condition, antithesis, and that this then generates synthesis. So, uh, like meets opposite and creates a middle ground, at which point that middle ground meets its opposite and creates a middle ground. And that this process is repeated over and over again, so much so that change, no matter how infinitely is varied, and this is his own words, shows only a cycle of constant repetition. In nature, nothing new happens under the sun. So he goes on to explain this as a philosophy of how ideas are created and how ideas change over time. Um, and this also adds to that feeling of nationalism, like the spirit of pride in where they are, because, as he puts it, the ultimate goal of this dialect is to reach perfect knowledge of self, and that the Western European grouping, the Western European area was almost there. Like that's what they thought, and because of that, they felt that they were better than anyone else because they were in the last stages of that dialect, of that synthesis. Um, Now from there you have Schopenhauer, and this one is more pessimistic, very dark almost. He is sure that um, the world is uh, it is cold. It is very there's no reason. It's just it's as it says, burdened by suffering, unrelenting suffering, and um, that there is a life will, um, and that this life will basically uh, is an impersonal force uh, that doesn't really, it's not for good or bad. It's simply um, gives rise to disorder and delusion. And so, in that, there is growth in that simply because it's a like because this disorder and this disillusionment leads to a contemplation of the self, and that this in turn leads to um, the deeper understanding of self. But um, it's not because we overcome the ideas of the suffering. It's because we accept it and find temporary solace in art and music and liberation through spiritual insight, as they say. Um, and but it's very fatalistic. So he's kind of very melancholy. Now from there we're going to go on to Darwin. Now Darwin is both extremely ahead of his time, but also extremely misquoted. So um, the original idea of Darwin. Now he did a lot of exploration, a lot of data collecting, and one of the things that he comes upon is the idea that he's not the first one who says that there is evolution. That is actually Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck that actually first shows that there's perpetual change in species, so there's evolution. But Darwin, what he's able to determine is um, that a lot of the more complex organisms that exist now were a product of simpler organisms that simply changed over and over again. And this is also where he comes up with what's called natural selection. So the idea that a specific change will allow a specific individual of a species to do better than, say, another change. Like, say, for example, if a creature suddenly had an opposable thumb, and multiple of those creatures were born with an opposable thumb, they're going to have a better chance of survival and a better chance of succeeding than those without an opposable thumb, which means the ones with the opposable thumbs will continue breeding together, and in doing so, perpetuate the opposable thumb until eventually there are no ones without the opposable thumb, that the opposable thumbs will win. So natural selection, the survival of the fittest. That's the ones that are going to be the ones that are going to be, I guess you'd say, more able to survive. Those are the ones that are going to actually um, continue perpetuating their species and thereby make that change permanent. Um, the problem is that this then gets used in terms that it wasn't really intended to be used in. So it was intended to be used as a biology thing, a natural selection, how creatures evolved, but it ends up um, going farther and going into um, going into well, I mean, I guess you could say he kind of perpetuates it at first with the descent of man, um, because he talks about how um, basically men are the product of this same natural selection. So remember, this is all um, kind of leading from the idea that things change, but also remember this is coming up against the idea that God created the world and created man in his image and as a static, creation. And so this becomes the first part of the controversy. The idea that people weren't always people in the sense that they exist at the time, but that they evolved into these people. This is against what is the popularly held belief held by religious people. So that's the first part. From here, he gets more misaligned in the sense that others take his theory and apply it to other elements of life, like society. Okay, so unfortunately, he used a favored races in his title, but he wasn't really talking about races per se. He was talking about like favorite races of different organisms and how they are better able to survive. But unfortunately, this gets applied to people, and this actually leads very, very directly to ideas like those held by Adolf Hitler, saying that certain types of people are better able to survive and somehow more evolved. Uh, and this idea of eugenics, um, basically meaning that they're going to use eugenics to eliminate certain elements of society that are less desirable, that are less evolved, and thereby increase the evolution of man. But again, that wasn't actually Darwin doing that. That was other people applying Darwin's idea of nature to basically to support their idea that certain races needed to be more exalted than others. Um, so from here, we go on to the next big thing that I guess you could say shapes the time, which is the Industrial Revolution. So you've got the steam engine, and it's invented by Watt in 1765. And at first, it's used in limited elements to pump out mines, okay? But quickly it expands to the textile industry and to other manufacturing industries, and before long it's got, you've got steam engines, hurling railroads vast distances in short amounts of time, comparatively speaking, with before. And what this does is this greatly changes the labor force, because now women and children are part of the labor force, and it also does a huge impact on the environment because um, in Britain, where the Industrial Revolution started, it lays waste to huge sections of the British countryside. Um, it uh, raises a what didn't really exist in huge amounts before, which was basically tenements, which are densely packed groupings of buildings that are used by the lowest class of labor force, and it's squalid conditions. It's the only way they can survive. So they are, for the most part, working in these factories that are created by this industrial revolution. They're poorly paid. They're working in deplorable, horrific conditions, and it's everything from women down to children, little children, because some of these machines are best used by little hands, which means young children. Um, so you've got, again, this growing dichotomy between the exaltation of the sublime of nature and the horrific conditions that are created by the Industrial Revolution. So enter into this Wordsworth and some of the other poets of the time. Now, one of the characteristics of a lot of the poets of the time is almost a kind of generally held um, melancholy. Okay, so like they're all kinds of a little bit depressed. Um, so, for example, you've got Wordsworth, and he, again, the nature is sublime, um, and very big on the fact that nature is the pinnacle of all creating. Okay, but also that when a poet um, that it's possible for a poet to capture some of this, or an artist to capture some of this sublime by capturing the idea that nature is in that moment. Um, and um, and it's not necessarily capturing amazing events, but capturing everyday events and seeing the sublime in them. Okay, and so he actually ends up collaborating with with another uh, poet, Coleridge, and they do the lyric ballads. And one of his is he ends up visiting the ruins of a medieval monastery, and this kind of colors the whole this time period too. Is an exaltation of medieval times to some degree, and so it talks a little bit more about his about that, the seeing the life of things by examining nature and then capturing it in bits of poetry. It's a way to make that sublime last for longer. Okay, now from there you have Shelley, which Percy Shelley is the first one we're going to look at, and this one is um, again he he goes farther. Okay, so Wordsworth already does a lot of the melancholy and sublime, but Percy Shelley actually goes farther into the exalting the beautiful and despairing of overall society. And so he goes into more of these great big swings between this is amazingly beautiful and life is horrifying. Now again, remember that this is all set to the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, the atrocities that were being visited on slaves. I mean, there's a lot of negative, and they're trying to create a romantic view in the midst of this negative. So they continue with the idea of exaltation of the sublime, and he ends up and he's not only is he against a lot of the stuff that's going on, he's also against, like, as far as the Industrial Revolution, he's also against a lot of the, I guess you could say, normal um, society. So, for example, he is not really in favor of marriage. He doesn't believe that that's he thinks that it's against the natural order, I guess you could say. Um, and so he ends up with one wife, and then he ends up running off with another woman and stuff like that. But he, again, you see in his life the same exaltation of the sublime and the sinking into depression back and forth. Okay, and then from there, you have his poetry, which exalts the same sort of dichotomy, and um, he uses a lot of the symbolism of the West to, um, or the symbolism of nature to capture the idea of, by capturing nature, you capture that sublime and make it last a little bit longer. So, for example, the symbolism of the West, the winds of the West, um, or the West wind, and it's supposed to be the personification of creativity, which is, obviously greatly sought by any poet. And so, again, capturing nature to show the how amazing it can be, and in doing so, making that amazing last for a bit. Keats does the same things, and he is also English, and he again, a lot of these guys are very melancholy. So his big thing is life's got so many great pleasures, but they all leave, so they all end, and he laments that. Now, some of this again, it's experience based because he lost his mother and his brother to tuberculosis, and he actually ends up dying from the same thing when he's 25. So in that time, he knows that life is very fleeting, and so it kind of leads him to, I guess you could say, a little bit more of a, live while you can kind of idea, and even comes up with beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that is all on earth and all you need to know. So he exalts the beauty of life, with the understanding that in his eyes it's fleeting and we need to capture it while we can. Um, and then from there we have Byron, who is very much a romantic hero in and of himself. And let me scroll down to him. He does two major works. Don Juan was his last work. So in both of these works, he is the star of the show. Both of them are like he is the main character in his stuff. And in Don Juan, it's based on the same idea that was in Mozart's Don Giovanni, which is like the womanizer, but less of it's less based on the womanizing aspects and more on um, mm, again a exaltation of the beauty of love and um, nature and how good things can be. And so he does, like I said, he does those two, and he ends up uh, writing both of them are basically like his lifelong work, because he writes that Don Juan is written towards the end of his life, and they cover throughout his whole life. From there, we have Blake, and Blake is more like the ones that we've talked about before were pretty much strictly writers, but Blake is kind of the jack of all trades. He's the poet, painter, engraver, and also a mystic, or like looks into the mystical. And because of this, when he does a work, he does everything for his work. So he will write it, he will paint it, he will do the engraving for it. I mean, he does all aspects of whatever he publishes. Um, and some of his are, for example, The Lamb, which is a short poem, and it basically shows the lamb as a personification of God's gentle goodness. He also, like the others, is a bit depressing, to the point where in one of his poems, The Tiger, it's talking about um, like whether goodness has to have evil to be good, and if God is responsible for both. So again, you have him, I don't know, like not he's they're all a little bit melancholy. They're all trying to figure out um the meaning of it all, and despairing of finding it. But if you look at the time in which they're writing, like I said, the dichotomy of you're supposed to be exalting beauty in nature while we're laying waste to it in rapid form through the Industrial Revolution, it's not really shocking. But he wasn't actually very big in his time, sadly enough. He didn't become big until after he was gone. And then from there we have Faust. Now, Faust was actually originally like the idea of Faust was not the first time that particular character had appeared. Um, Christopher Marlowe had written a version of him, but in this one, uh, it spanned Goethe's entire career. He went from doing part one, and basically the whole story is a deal between. It starts out with a deal between God and Satan, Mephistopheles, and saying that there's no way that Satan can convince Faust, who is a devout Christian and uh, learned gentleman and a good person, to give up his soul to Satan for anything. And so they make a wager, God and Satan, and then Satan ends up wagering with Faust, saying, if I'm able to fulfill your um, desire for ultimate knowledge, and that you'll give me your soul. And so one of the things he ends up doing is having him experience life instead of just sitting in a study and learning about life, but to experience it. And he ends up um, in a love affair, and this is all in the story. He ends up in a love affair with Gretchen, and it's tragic in the sense that it's a huge, tumultuous love affair, but it ends up with the death of the mother, Gretchen's mother, an illegitimate child, brother, and ultimately Gretchen. From there, he continues to travel. He does end up meeting a bunch of figures from history, from fantasy, witches, sirens, you name it, um, even Helen of Troy. But he is still not satisfied with what he has seen or known. His soul is not satisfied. He doesn't feel fulfilled. And so finally he ends up finding fulfillment in um, basically doing for others. So he does this whole land reclamation project and provides housing for millions of people. And in this, he finally finds fulfillment, but dies before fully realizing his dream. And even though Satan Mephistopheles tries to get the soul, God's angels, led by Gretchen, who was steadfast through all of it, is able to intercept the soul and take it to heaven. So that writing of that particular story took his entire life. So it is his whole life. So anyway, from there we have this is also the first age where you're going to have a lot of really well-known female writers, although they are often still writing under male pseudonyms. So, for example, um, you have one that's known as George Eliot, but it's actually Mary Ann Evans, and then you have Emily Bronte. Now she writes as herself, and she writes. We've all heard of Wuthering Heights. Many of us read it in high school and such. You have um, Charlotte Bronte, who wrote Jane Eyre, and then you have Mary Goodwin Shelley. Now this one, we're going to talk about a little bit more about that, but this one writes Frankenstein, and um, then you have one that many of us know probably because they tend to make a lot of movies for it, and it's Jane Austen. And this is Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. Now, in most of these, even though they're female writers, you would think they'd be more feminist in their writing, but often they're still not. They're still, I guess you could say, giving into the idea of the better, more powerful, more worthy man. Um, but Jane Austen's are a little bit different. They kind of poke some fun at that. They don't like Jane Austen's heroines tend to be a little bit more witty, more developed in their own right, more less dependent on a man to make them worthy, and more able to see their own worth and to pursue their own worth. And this is in pretty much all of her novels. It spans all of her novels, like this idea. Um, and then getting back to Shelley. So Mary Shelley married, we talked about Percy Shelley, the author. Okay, so Mary Shelley is the daughter of, if you remember from the Enlightenment age, you had Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was one of the major um, feminist writers, and I mean, huge proponent. So Mary Shelley is her daughter, and she marries Percy Shelley, and she also becomes a writer. And in that, she ends up creating um, this idea of uh, she's the first one that explores the dangers, I guess you could say, of scientific experimentation. Because in her story, you've got the scientist who is exploring the human mind and exploring a way to bring life into inanimate objects. And in doing so, he does bring life. He is able to, but it ends up turning horribly awry and becoming a monster in its own right, and horrible and horrific, and uh, it was supposed to be a great discovery and a great leap forward, and it ends up being not the exact opposite. And that's really all we're going to cover right now. I'm going to cover romanticism in just a bit.